I was reading through one of my notebooks recently and I came across this idea for a film I'd had called What's the Deal with the Tower in the Woods? I remember having this idea after coming back from one of the most incredible flights of my life. I fly these things called paramotors, and a friend of mine, Tom, had told me about this incredible tower that I should fly to, which is literally 15 minutes away from where I am in England. So the next flyable day comes around and a group of us decide to go and fly this tower. And right away, it didn't feel like any other flight I'd ever done before. As soon as I was off the ground, I could see this tower just sticking up above the horizon like a hand beckoning me to come closer. And as we get closer, the vibe completely changes. And it's difficult to explain, but the landscape just feels significant somehow. Like something big had happened here a long time ago, and it had left some kind of an energetic mark on the place. A few minutes after we arrived, it began to rain, so we had to quickly fly home. And I really didn't think too much more about it until about 3 days ago, when I found this notebook. As soon as I read the title of the video, all of the intrigue of the flight came flooding back to me in an instant, and I've been obsessed ever since. So what's the deal with the tower in the woods? The tower in question is this 250-year-old giant called King Alfred's Tower. It's situated on this big country estate called Stour Head, and it's insanely beautiful. But once I started researching this tower, I quickly realized that I wasn't actually looking at the picture, but I was simply looking at the frame. This tower, as impressive as it is, literally stands for something greater. Something so great that I owe my very existence to it, and it would lead me down a 1,200-year-old rabbit hole that would blow my mind. So the year is 876, and the second from last kingdom of Britain has just fallen. Yep, you heard me right. The second from last kingdom. You see, back in the 8th and 9th century, Britain was literally like something out of Game of Thrones, without the dragons. It was made up of 7 kingdoms and 7 royal families. Then in the late 700s, the Vikings began to invade. Now I say they began to invade because in the early days it was seasonal, meaning that they would invade in the warmer months between April and September and then return home for the winter. But by the year 876, the invasions had become permanent, and the Vikings had overthrown all but one kingdom. This kingdom was called Wessex, and it was ruled by this guy, a 22-year-old Anglo-Saxon king named Alfred. Not only was this kingdom the last of the 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, but he was the last of his bloodline, inheriting the throne after his father and 4 brothers had died or been killed. He was quite literally the last king standing.
Now that I know more, I want to fly the tower again. The more I read about this story, the more amazing it becomes. When Alfred became king, he immediately began leading his people into battle with the Vikings, including one of the bloodiest in the country's history at Ashdown. And he was doing really well and regaining some ground. But that was all about to change in the winter of 878 during a Christian festival at Chippenham, where there was a surprise attack by the Vikings. During this attack, Alfred and a handful of his men were driven into the marshlands, where they would have to survive the winter in hiding. Now, winters in England are harsh and damp, and the cold goes right to your bones. It must have been absolutely brutal for them. Then one by one, Alfred sent out his men to give word to the people of Wessex that their king was still alive, and to prepare for battle.
Probably one of the most famous stories of King Alfred took place at this time. He was on his own and had taken refuge in a peasant woman's hut, and the legend goes that she wasn't aware that he was the king and had left him in charge of some cakes that were baking in the oven. But Alfred's mind was so preoccupied that he neglected his duties and the cakes burned. And there's this scene described of the peasant woman scolding Alfred, only to then realize that he was actually her king. Speaking of neglecting duties, it's come to my attention that 88% of you are not subscribed to my channel.
You cannot be serious!
So if you're enjoying this video and you want to show your appreciation, please click the subscribe button and give us a thumbs up. It doesn't cost anything, and it tells YouTube that my channel's worth promoting to others. And if you're still watching at this point, then hopefully you concur.
Dr. Harris.
Yes?
Do you concur?
So the significance of this tower is multi-layered. Construction was completed in 1772 to commemorate the end of the 7-year war with France, the ascension of King George III, and the memory of King Alfred the Great. But it stands in this particular spot because it's believed this is where King Alfred gathered his armies to mount the final attack on the Vikings. However, that sounds like wishful thinking by the original owner of the estate, as historians believe the gathering was more likely to have taken place 9 miles east of here, which is where I'm heading next. So straight ahead of me is the forest of Iley Oak, where it's believed that King Alfred gathered his remaining armies. Must have been a strange feeling, as until recently these men would have been convinced that Alfred had been killed in the Christian festival a few months earlier. But just imagine the sight here of several thousand soldiers taking their final orders from the king. The final showdown against the Vikings, alongside the last king of the Saxons. In the morning, they rose before dawn and marched to Edington. And this is where it's thought the battle took place, near the White Horse of Bratton Camp. And it was documented that Alfred had to hang in there tenaciously, persevering for a long time before, with God's will, he won the victory. From there, Alfred and his army drove the Vikings north, where they would later surrender. The Vikings had been defeated.
So why am I making this video as opposed to my normal flying adventures? Why the history lesson? Well, the truth is, I've been longing to reconnect on my roots, and this project gave me the perfect opportunity to do that. I moved to Canada from the UK several years ago, which gave me the opportunity to look at my country from the outside and realize just how special it is. In fact, the old Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Wessex is where I was born and raised. The Saxons are my ancestors. Learning all of this and sharing it through my love of storytelling and flying has been really moving, and reminds me that it's experiences like this are the reason I started my YouTube channel in the first place. Go on adventures, bring back stories, and tell the world. And the story of King Alfred the Great is one of the most inspiring stories of tenacity and courage that we have. If you'd like to experience the King Alfred's Tower flight yourself, and you have a VR headset like this, you can do so by clicking on this link here. Thank you so much for joining me on this one, and I'll see you again soon.